This next section is going to be on our resource browser and how we deal with different types of resources and the different types of resources that we have available in PIXERA. Let's jump in. All right, so if we go to our resource browser, we have a bunch of different folders here already. The one that we start with is this standard content. But obviously, if we're going to be making a project here, we're going to want to bring in more types of content. And the way we do that is with our resource toolbar down here. And this gives us access to a whole bunch of different types of resources. So the first and most obvious one is on the left here. We have this plus button to add a resource from file. And so if I click on that, it's going to pull up a directory, a dialog in order for me to go look for some content. And I do have some on my D drive here. I've got some content. And in this content folder, I can go find some videos. I've got some 16:9 videos. And I can just grab all of those. I can shift click those. I can group select them. We look down in the bottom right here. We can see what file extensions we are looking at here. So what formats. And if I click open, we're going to bring all of those video files in. And you can see that I get a little spinning arrow here. And we get a one task, one conversion, and that'll end soon there. So what that is doing is when we bring in video content into our resource browser, we are generating preview files for our preview workspace here. These files are different than what is rendered out and playing out of our outputs. This is just for the preview. We can go change those settings by going to Settings, Preview, and we can see how many parallel conversion tasks we're going to be running at the same time, what the preview resolution is, what the preview format is. Its default is VP9 in a WebM container. We can click on that. We see we've got a bunch of other options here. Your currently running preview conversions will also populate here. So if I were to go back to compositing and bring in some more videos, perhaps that one there, I could go back to settings and we can see here's this this progress bar telling me how long that conversion is taking. So once I've brought in some resources, I can go ahead and resize my layout a bit, and I can grab this column right here and click and drag out. And that gives us just some more information about each of our resources here. And specifically, the thing I want to look at is the path of each resource. And we can see that the path is where these media files are located on our actual hard drive. I could always right click on this and say Show File in Explorer, and that'll just bring up in my Windows Explorer where that file is. These are the actual files. These are not the preview files. If we want to go find the preview files, we would go to Settings, Preview, and here we have a location for preview cache. And we can see currently that's in the CRX cache preview. And this is the default location for this. I could always click here to assign a new location for this if I wanted to. Or I can navigate to there and I can say CRX cache preview. And we can see that this is creating a proxy directory based on where those media files are. So this proxy directory is a similar path, but in a different location as the real files. They are just a different format. Something really important to know about the difference between preview files and our actual content is our preview files are stored locally on the C drive in that RX cache preview, and they are following the path of where that file is actually. If for some reason you import content from an external hard drive or a flash drive, and that flash drive is no longer connected, it is possible that you'll have a preview file that is rendering in your preview, but nothing playing back on your output, as that output no longer has access to a file that was removed if it was on some sort of external hard drive. There's one other way that we can get content into our resource browser, and that is by dragging it in from File Explorer itself. So if I go back to that content folder, I can actually just click on this videos folder. And if I click and drag this into my media folder here, it'll actually import that folder, all of its content, and all of its folders within it. So it'll import everything, and I can see all those previews getting created in my preview settings. Now, as we're talking about content here, one thing to look at in our resource browser is when we click on a resource, over in the inspector, we can see a bunch of information about it. And a really important piece of information is the codec of that resource. And we can see that our standard content here is H.264, where 2 of our videos are VP9 codecs. Now, codecs are really important because each codec has a different performance capability within PIXERA. H.264 is generally not a very good codec for media server playback, as it's intended for something like YouTube videos or videos you see on the internet. PIXERA prefers something like HAP or Notch LC. Those are all really great codecs. If you're interested in learning more about codecs, then there's a link in the description to our Help Juice article on codecs and codec compatibility that'll give you a little more information about what codecs PIXERA prefers and which ones are better for playback. One other type of resource that we can import when using the resource browser, if I click the plus button here, is an image sequence. So here we can see that I have an image sequence that's about 1800 frames. If I just select the first one and hit open, it's going to recognize it as an image sequence. And I can put in the FPS of that sequence, in this case 60, and hit yes. And now when I click and drag it onto my screen, it's brought that one image in as the whole entire sequence. I could also just bring in one image. This image is going to, because I have these numbers here, is going to ask me if it's an image sequence. In this case, I'm going to say no, as I only want that one image. Got to be careful here because it's definitely possible to import something like this and say yes. And now when I bring this on, if I zoom in really, really far here, we can see that this is just a 4 or 5 frame image sequence that's just going to be repeated over and over. So be careful with your image sequence imports. There are many other tools down here and ways we can import resources. One of the things I want to talk about is how to create folders in our resource browser. And we can do that using this folder icon, this add folder. So if I'm clicked into some folder like the media folder, I can click that button and it'll add a folder. And I can double click this and I can say training, and that will rename that folder. Let's collapse this and resize our workspace a little bit and look over at the inspector. When I click on this folder, we can rename it here as well. So I could rename this training test. So over in our folder, we have a lot of other options here. We can tell this folder to be a watch folder, where I can click on this dialog box, which will open up this dialog for me. And I could go specify a specific folder to look at so that if a file is added to that directory, it will automatically be added into the resource browser. There's some other options down there as well. We also have these resource distribution options, which we'll get into in another video. There's also file versions, which we can set per folder, and we can also set per resource. So if I click on a resource, I can go down. I also have file versioning here, and that will automatically look for a version 1 or _V. So it's automatically looking for _V as the particular prefix or suffix. All right, so we have talked about how to import media resources, but we have a whole bunch of other buttons down here. Let's go through those and the other types of resources we can add into our project. So again, this plus button is for adding media. If I'm highlighted into a folder, I can add those media files, or I can add a text resource or something like a color resource, a web browser resource. And these three resources are kind of our basic resources. The rest of these are a little more advanced. We'll go over them in other videos, but I'll talk about them briefly here. We have a compositing resource, which is where we would import an Unreal project or a notch block. A layer reference resource, a multi-resource, and finally, a live input resource. And again, we'll talk about these in other videos, but just to give you an idea of what they are in this brief overview. We also have the ability to remove selected resources, so we could group select a bunch of these and delete them at the same time. And then this ellipses here gives us a couple of different layout options for our resource browser itself. So I could collapse all of my folders at the same time if everything gets a little too messy. I could toggle between a list view, which is what we're in right now, and a matrix view. And I can also toggle the icon height if things are getting a little too spread out and I want to be able to see my content a little easier. All right, let's spend a little bit of time talking about some of these resources individually. We'll start with the color resource. If we click and drag this into our workspace from our resource browser, we'll add it to the project. I can go select my resource again, and in the inspector, I have more information about it. I could rename that resource. I can also select the color. We have some prearranged colors here. Or you can go to choose custom color and select your own color. You can also add a gradient if you would like. There's some other options down here in the inspector. The color resource is really useful for something like a light card if you're working in virtual production, or you can use it in conjunction with another feature we'll talk about called blend modes if you want to add some unique creative control to your project. We can use a color resource in conjunction with something like a text resource in order to bring text into our project. The way we do that is we can select our text resource, and over in the inspector, I can say training text. And then I can enter my text here. So I could say, hello world. We have some other options for size and font, as well as some alignment options. Now, this resource is not brought into our project as a layer like this. We're actually going to bring it down to this little slot right here, something we call the object slot, where I can bring this text onto my layer, and the text is going to be used as a mesh that the texture is going to apply itself to. So this no longer brilliant blue color, this now green color, is going to apply itself to that text resource that we've just created. All right, next up we have the web browser resource. Once again, I can click on it and drag it into my workspace. And nothing's going to happen initially, and that's because this still says unnamed web browser. We haven't actually given this web browser resource somewhere to go to. So if I click on that resource, I can go into my inspector, and we can see there's a parameter slot for a URL. And so I could type in something simple like PIXERA.1 and hit enter. And we can see that that's going to bring up the PIXERA.1 URL as a resource within our project. Some use cases for the web browser resource would be something like a custom created website that you want to use that some user can interact with that's coming through an exhibit. Something like that would be a great use for the web browser resource.